At that point, there were 2,000 trekkers in the Trans-Orange, in the Free State. So they, so you can imagine these trekkers are up there near the Sterkfontein Dam, or even closer to the escarpment, the edge of the escarpment, and they look down upon the land of milk and honey, and it's just too beautiful for words. And they already start kind of competing within themselves as to where they're going to have their farms. And Retief goes off and he has a meeting with Dingaan, and Dingaan agrees to consider land for the trekkers, but there are two conditions. One is Retief has to return stolen cattle that a Batlokwa chief had stolen from him. This chief's base was where Vicksburg is now. And the other was he wanted 11 guns. Now, why 11 guns? Heaven alone knows. So he wanted the stolen cattle back and 11 guns, and then he would consider land for the trekkers. The resident missionary at Umgungundluvu, at Dingaan's kraal, warned Retief that the land in question was already being considered for the British at Port Natal, and that Dingaan couldn't be trusted. So after this meeting with Dingaan, Retief and his small party traveled to Port Natal for business and to get provisions, and then they head back to, if I could call it, the Sterkfontein Dam. But upon their arrival down at the bottom of the valley, the Boers had already moved down into the Tugela Valley. And by the end of 1837, there were already approximately 1,000 wagons down there, and Retief had not yet gained permission from Dingaan for land. I mean, we weren't taught that, were we? Right. Retief goes up to Vicksburg and retrieves the stolen cattle, sends it back to Dingaan, but not the guns. November 1837, back to the Free State, if I can call it that. Potgieter, who is not happy with their little skirmish with the Matabele, he and Ace decide that they're going to go and thump the Matabele a second time. And Andries Pretorius, who's farmed at Letskraal, he's up there doing a recce, checking the lay of the land, and he goes along. And so it's Andries Pretorius, Potgieter, and Ace, and 330 trekkers. And they go up to the Zeerust area once again, and they attack the Matabele. It makes very interesting reading if you want to Google those battles, the Battle of Mosega and Ekap, Kapitein, and so on, fighting the Matabele. They go up there, they have no losses, they kill 3,000 of the 20,000 Matabele. And the Matabele flee all the way to what is now known as Matabele land, Zimbabwe. Now, this brings me to an interesting point, and I find it so interesting that the media have never, ever really raised this issue. The media have created the impression that when the whites went into the interior of this country, they don't even talk about different tribes. The blacks were living in harmony, and the whites went up there and took their land. That is really the short of the story. There was continual movement and fighting, and a specific tribe only lived in a specific area until the enemy came over the hills and massacred them and took their wives and children and moved on. So there was continual movement of tribes throughout Africa. The Zulus, well, the Nguni people from whom the Zulu stem, they only arrived on the east coast of this country in the early 1800s. The Zulu nation as such was only really established in 1816, and we're now talking 1837. And the Matabele were a branch of the Zulus. They had broken away, and they were wreaking havoc up in the Free State, and then, of course, now they've chased into Matabele land. And what I want to know is, when we talk land restitution and land claims, the poor Matabele, surely they can come back and claim the Free State then? You know, isn't that where they hail from? But one never reads that anywhere. You know, they shouldn't be up in Zim. In fact, their base at one point was where the city of Pretoria is now. That is where the Matabele were, and at one point in Mpumalanga as well. So that's the story about the Matabele. Then, on the 16th of February, we're back now in Natal. 16th of February, 1838, Retief, 67 men and 30 labourers. When I say labourers, tow layers, you know, the guys driving oxen and so on. But they were on horseback, but I'm not sure why there were so many labourers. But they visit Dingaan to finalise the land agreement. But there are already over 1,000 wagons down in Dingaan's land, bear that in mind. But they're now going to finalise, to negotiate this land agreement with Dingaan. As we know, all are murdered. Well, riveting reading if you want to know what happened there. And these are things that most people aren't even aware of. You know, they were taken up to the hill where the executions take place. They had stakes driven up their rear ends. Retief was the last guy. He had to watch this happen to all the other people. And then, of course, they were all killed. But also riveting reading if you want some interesting info as to what happened there on that day when Retief was murdered. So then the next day, on the 17th of Feb, the Zulus attacked the trekkers that were had outspanned in the Blowkrans area. And that was also one of those dreadful attacks. 41 men were killed, 56 women, 185 children, and 200 staff were all killed because they were caught off guard. The 25,000 cattle and thousands of sheep were driven away. I'll just stress that again to give you an idea as to how much stock there was. The trekkers were devastated, their leader was killed, and where to now? Maritz then had to take the lead. Somebody had to take leadership. He wasn't well, and he then sent Sarel Sohier, again, remember the man who later at Blood River did the vow, and Sarel Sohier's cousin, Frans Hutter, back to Letskraal at the top end of Pretoria's Kloof to tell Pretorius, listen, because Pretorius had already considered moving, but he was still farming happily. So we need you now, get a move on. So, just by the way, I'm not sure whether you people know why it's called Pretorius Kloof, from Rooderbloem all the way to Kalonisplaas, because all that ground was owned by Pretorius's, from Rooderbloem all the way up to Kalonisplaas. That's why it's called Pretorius Kloof. And obviously the road went along the river because that's where the oxen could drink. So a little bit about Andries Pretorius. He grew up at Driekoppen, which today we know as Glenharry, and then farmed at Letskraal from 1818 to 1838. He leaves Letskraal on the 1st of October 1838 and arrives in Natal on the 22nd of November 1838. But he went ahead on horseback. His trek followed him. He had 68 wagons. Well, in his party, there were 68 wagons and 130 people, and 20 of the 68 wagons belonged to him. Then, the 16th of December, the Blood River. So, you know what we were all taught at school, the trekkers left, and then Dingaan killed Retief, and then there was Blood River. So we're almost at the end of this now, for those of you falling asleep. The 16th of December, 1838, Blood River was a revenge attack. They went out there to provoke the Zulu. They wanted to sort the Zulus out. It wasn't just a lager and the Zulus came and attacked them. They went out there on a mission, and that was to fight the Zulus. There were 57 wagons. a total of 652 people in that lager, no women. Right, not at Blood River. There were no women because this was retribution and war. There were 464 trekkers, 3 British, 120 black scouts, and 65 labourers. 4 trekkers were injured, 3,000 Zulus approximately were killed. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm almost done. But I just want to share this with you. It's a relatively new topic that sort of has come to become popular over the last number of years, and it's that of transgenerational trauma. In our own little community here, if you consider that it's only recently that the Afrikaner, that many of the Afrikaner folk can kind of cope with the English because that bloody war in 1900. You know, they're only now kind of beginning. There are people who only now, in fact, I know a lady in this town who still hasn't forgiven the British, but she's in her 90s, you know. But the children are kind of getting there now. That's transgenerational trauma. That's when the great-grandparents tell the grandparents how dreadful the English were. The grandparents tell their children, don't do business with the English and don't you dare marry an English girl because how dreadful they are. And that's transgenerational trauma and it gets passed on. If you consider the whole Afrikaner thing, and you know, the frontier wars, I mean, 500 homes were attacked, many of them more than once in the border area. They had the English issues, the issues with the English government. They moved over the Orange into the Free State and into Natal, and where they were constantly on their guard. And the minute they let their guard down, they were attacked with very, very serious consequences. In my opinion, and I'm an Afrikaner from this area, that is why we are so different to the folk up in Limpopo and Mpumalanga and those areas. They're also Afrikaners, but they're very right-wing. And there's a very good reason for that. And I think it's due to transgenerational trauma, where that thing has been passed down and passed down and passed down. Right, now, I'm almost done. I want to just tell you, I said I would tell you about the Potgieter trek passing through Graafrenet in 1819. This is short and sweet. This is the diary. It's written, translated from Dutch into Afrikaans. So I'm just going to kind of translate as I go along, and it's really quick and easy. And I think you'll find it interesting because it's our area. So this research was done by Johnny Loog, Johan Loog, who passed away recently, and Willem's father. And of course, it's about this. Fortunately, there was one of that party kept a diary, so it's really nice that we. Potgieter didn't write it. Somebody in the. But it is, I suppose it would be known as Potgieter's diary. Yeah. But because remember, Hendrik Potgieter's elder brother was the leader of this group. Potgieter was in that group. Hendrik Potgieter was in that group, but the elder brother was the leader of this family trek from Addo, coming through Graafrenet in 1819. 102 wagons and 600 people and lots of stock. And the man who kept the diary was a man called Rudolf Herold. With a T, Dave, you would be glad to hear. And so they travelled all along the Sundays River from Addo, got to Graafrenet. Now, why they didn't stay with the Sundays River from Graafrenet, I don't know. Perhaps the Sundays River was in flood. But I think perhaps, too, with the amount of stock, you know, perhaps 40,000 sheep or whatever it was, that these Pretoriuses up this Pretorius Kloof weren't going to be too happy to have this stock, you know, coming up through their farms. But they chose not to go up the Pretorius Kloof. And he says here, so we left Graafrenet and we got to the first Hoogte. And I think this Johnny Loog wrote this in Perry's Hoogte. So we all know where Perry's Hoogte is. Do you know where that is, Mick? So if you're driving north from Graafrenet, the first little pass you go up. where the Rupert turn off to their farm is on the left. That is Perry's-Wigte. And he says the kloof. Now, I've spoken to Tim and to Julian and the guys that are interested in these things. We're not quite sure where they went up. We know where the wagon trail was later years, but where they went up, we don't know, because he says it was the incline was so steep that they, with ropes, I'm sure you've all seen that painting of the guys holding the wagons to prevent them from falling. They had to do that to get up onto Perry's-Wigte. So whether it was from where the Rupert farm up that side or around from the Clifton side, I don't know, because it's not quite that steep from that side, from the Sundays River side. But anyway, so it was very steep to get up there, and he says when they got to the flat ground, they drew a laager there, and there they had to stay for a few weeks. The first night, a lion appeared and grabbed a young ox. And the lion was so strong that it didn't drag the ox, it actually ran away with the ox in its mouth. And they got out their guns and they chased the lion and they shot it and they found the dead lion the next morning. Then there's no mention of how they got from Perry's-Wigte over into the Goliathskraal, the next pass. There's no mention of that. But he says, eventually we reach Amandelwigte. Now that is the Goliathskraal basin. Goliathskraal on the right, Klipfontein, the Rupert farm on the left. And that's called Amandelwigte, the next little pass, which if you go up there, you end up at Appleberry, Abbotsbury, and Wellwood and the Glen. So that's Amandelwigte. And he says, so we reach Amandelwigte, and it Skaars was the donker. It was dusk, and the lion started roaring. And Hans, an old slave, called out, "What dog is that?" And he shouted, "Voetsek, Voetsek your Satan," and threw a burning log at it, and then the lion roared and ran away. The lion returned, and they shot it. The next morning, a patrol went out to find a way to make a road over Amandelwigte, and they discovered a Bushmanstad, I suppose. Right, so I'm sharing this with you because this is important information. We need to know these things. They find a Bushmanstad in a geveg het ontstaan. There was a battle, and they burnt it down, and they took the children captive. Because that is what was done in those days. That, you know, you must see these things in context. Right, so then when they got over Amandelwigte eventually, they divided their group into three, and one had to look after the laager, the other had to look after the stock, and the other had to find a way over the next range of mountains, which is at the Glen. And he says here, this is in the diary, Jannie, seun van Petrus and Sarah Nordee. This little boy Jannie, son of Petrus and Sarah Nordee, was trying to climb onto the wagon as they were negotiating the mountain there at the Glen, and he slipped and the wheel went over him, and that is why it is called Nordeersburg. It was Jannie Nordee who was killed there. And he says it was too dangerous for them to stop there and to bury him. So I'm not sure what he means by danger, whether the incline was too steep or whether there were perhaps bushmen in the area or whatever. And they then wrapped him in a sheet and buried him the next day on the other side at the foot of that mountain. Then they went along to a very high mountain range. And at this mountain range, which is Lootsburg, the wagons literally had to be carried over the mountain. From there, they ended up at Middelburg at Grootfontein, where the family then had this big fight, and Hendrik Potgieter split from his brother and ended up in Tarka. And I haven't been able to research what the elder brother did, because he felt it was God's calling for them to trek north And whether they then crossed the Orange at that point, that I don't know. In the records that I have is that Louis Trichardt was the first trekker to cross the Orange River. And that's my story, ladies and gentlemen. Right, have a lovely lunch. I'm going home for my power nap and then I'm back to the office.